right. Up there we go. Let's see, Ms. Moore is here. Where are you, Ms. Moore? There you are. Okay.
Please note, as per my email, that discussion board number 2 is up with question for discussion board number 2. And please also note that I've extended it by a week. So you have an extra week to put up your thread and then your replies for the discussion board. Okie dokie. I think that's it. I think that's the only thing I wanted to mention. All right, moving on to the course. Where are we here? There we are. Talking about the Bible. And where did I end? I ended with the prophetic books. Oh, Septuagint. Excuse me. There we go. Let's get to that on the PowerPoint slide. Whoops. Went too far, Dr. Dunn. All right. Okay, the Bible. Yes, just the Bible. As I told you already, just to recap, there was no settled canon at the time of Jesus and the apostles, but no official. When I say settled, I mean no official list like that the Jews could say this is definitely it. There were for some books. So, for example, the Pentateuch. There was almost universal agreement on the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, the Pentateuch, as part of God's revelation. But after that, it was kind of up for grabs. Okay, there was some general agreement on the prophetic writings, and there was more disagreement on the other writings, the histories and stuff like that, books of poetry and other things. And so we see that in the Christian canon. Now, not all Jews spoke Hebrew anymore. The common language of culture was the Greek language of those who were educated and those who could read. And so eventually what happened was the Hebrew writings, or at least the Jewish revelation, was translated, at least part of it was translated into Greek. And this Greek translation is called the Septuagint. Why? Well, I'm going to tell you. Return my page. The Septuagint came about according to tradition. We don't know exactly historically, but there's a writing called the Letter of Aristeas. I don't think I put that on the PowerPoint, so I'll write it on the board for you. The Letter of Aristeas. And the Letter of Aristeas dates to around 120 BC. So circa 120 BC is when scholars believe that this Letter of Aristeas was written. And according to the Letter of Aristeas, it gives us the origin of the Septuagint. And according to the story in the letter, around 70 scholars, let's just say 70, Jewish scholars were in Alexandria, Egypt, and they were asked by the ruler of the time, this pagan ruler, to translate their Hebrew scriptures into Greek, which they did. All 70 scholars translated the scriptures independently. So you had 70 different translations, and lo and behold, miraculously, all 70 translations were the same. So it was kind of like a minor miracle, or you could call it a major miracle if you want, that all 70 of these Jewish scholars translated independently of each other the Hebrew scriptures into the Greek language, and wow, they all came up with the same translation. It's a Hanukkah miracle. You know what I'm saying? Anyways, that's the story, okay? Now, when I said that, it was a partial translation, or they translated partly the God's revelation to the Jews, according to, some people would take this to mean they translated the whole Bible, but if you read the letter as it stands, really what they probably did was they translated the first 5 books of the Bible, the law, which was something that all Jews agreed on, the Torah, the Pentateuch. Okay, they didn't translate necessarily the whole Bible. Nevertheless, it's a story. Whether it's historical or not, scholars debate whether it's historical or legendary. It's probably legendary, just to explain where the Septuagint came from. But this story does explain why it's called the Septuagint. Because the word Septuaginta in Latin means 70, the number 70. You speak Spanish, setenta. Okay? Comes from that word Septuagint. So it means the 70. So it's referring to this story in the letter of Aristeas that there were 70 Jewish scholars who did 70 translations of the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek, and all 70 translations turned out to be the same. Thanks be to God. Okay? The abbreviation for the Septuagint, in case you're wondering, because you might sometimes see this in writings, they abbreviate it with the Latin or Roman numerals LXX. So L means 50, is the number 50 in Latin, and then you have X meaning 10, and then 10, which equals 70. So sometimes you'll see the Septuagint simply abbreviated LXX in scholarly works and stuff like that, so they don't have to keep writing out the word Septuagint, right? But that's why it's abbreviated LXX, the 70. Wherever the Septuagint came from, we do know historically that Christians took over the Septuagint. It was used amongst Jews, God bless you, that were dispersed throughout the Mediterranean, outside Palestine, Jews that did not read Hebrew or understand Hebrew anymore. So we know that it was used amongst Jews. And the early Christians, who, as far as we know, were all Jews, took over this translation as their Bible. Now, the interesting thing about this is that when I talked about the canon being unsettled for Jews, that it wasn't officially settled yet, you can see this condition in the Septuagint because it includes what are books that are called the Deuterocanon, the second canon. Deuteros in Latin, in Greek means second, deuteros. In canon, as we know, means a yardstick, measuring stick. But here I'll just translate it canon. So literally the second measuring stick. But anyways, the second canon, which are these you can call them extra books or additional books that later the Jews would officially not accept into their canon. But apparently they did before. At least some Jews did, because they're in the Septuagint. So books like what? The Book of Tobit, the Book of Judith. There's a longer version of the Book of Esther, which Jews did later accept, but remember, there was discussion about that because Esther never mentions the word God, or God never appears in the Book of Esther, not even implicitly in the story. But someone wrote a longer book in Greek, a longer version of Esther in Greek, with all sorts of additions, with prayers to God and mentioning God and stuff like that. Two books of Maccabees, the Book of Wisdom, or it's also called the Wisdom of Solomon, the Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach, also called just the Book of Sirach, the Book of Baruch, and then the Book of Daniel. Again, Greek Daniel, there were later additions made to Daniel. This Book of Daniel, which Jews do accept, but other Jews had a longer version with some additional stories in the Greek. Okay, so you have a longer version in the Septuagint. So here you have your definition for the Deuterocanonicals. Basically, the name given to several books in the Old Testament whose authority was sometimes questioned. Might give a different definition if I did it over, but I'll stick with that one. Anyways, yes, because most of these books would not be accepted later on by the Jews when they officially set their canon, but at the time of Jesus and the apostles, they were accepted, at least by some Jews, and they were certainly accepted by the early Christian church because this was the Bible, the Septuagint, that they were quoting from. If you read the Christian writings in the New Testament, whenever they quote the Old Testament scriptures, the Jewish scriptures, we could say, about 2/3 of the time, they quote from the Septuagint. They follow the reading that's found in the Septuagint, not in the Hebrew originals that the Septuagint is supposedly based on. And many, if not most, of the early Christian authors, even outside of the New Testament, because we have Christian writings outside of the New Testament that don't make it in for whatever reason, but in those Christian authors, they use and cite the Septuagint frequently. That's their basis for Scripture, that they're using the Septuagint. And even in the New Testament, there are possibly some citations. Definitely there are allusions to these books, these what we call the deuterocanonical books in the New Testament. So they seem to be there. They're not necessarily quoted explicitly, but that's not necessary because, like, the book of Esther is never quoted explicitly, and that was accepted later by the Jews. Now, I mean, this doesn't necessarily prove in and of itself that the New Testament writers accepted the Deuterocanonicals as full canonical scripture. I mean, though it points in that way, it does point in the direction of acceptance of the Septuagint and its contents, because otherwise, why would they have not just used a shorter canon that the Jews accepted later on? According to the story, I mean, this is the story for the Jewish canon. How did that come about? How did they eventually come to accept a shorter one, apparently? The story is that sometime in the late 1st century AD, so maybe around the 90s AD, the Jews had a meeting, or at least there was a school that was established in Palestine of Jews. This was after the destruction of their temple. And the Jewish community finally decided, in theory, to accept a shorter canon, and these books just didn't make the cut for a variety of reasons. Even though we know in the 1st century there were Jews who were still using these books as scripture, but they just didn't make the official cut. Why was this done? Who made the decision? When was it made? We don't know for sure. We just have the story that there was this school established in a town in Palestine, and there were discussions amongst the rabbis. That's the story. But we actually can't pinpoint an actual date or who made the decision. That's just the story that's come down to us. But we do know that some of the other books, the Deuterocanonicals, still floated around for a time after that and were read and copied by Jews. How do we know this? Through archaeology. We found manuscripts of these documents amongst Jewish communities from the 1st century, from the time of Jesus. So, for example, portions of the book of Baruch, chapter 6, which is called the letter of Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, although it probably wasn't written by him. But anyways, it's Baruch chapter 6. In Greek, were found in Palestine in the south of Israel in the 1940s. It's I have to tell you the name just so you know. There's a group of writings called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let me show you on a map here, just to show you where it is. Go over to Israel. Whoops. There we are. Go out here a little bit. Country of Israel. And I'm trying to remember the dates. I want to say the late 1940s, but it could have been the mid-1940s. But anyways, in the 1940s of the last century, some kid, some boy, usually a shepherd boy in these stories when they find these things. But anyways, some kid was like wandering around and he found these caves and he found documents in them. It just happened, he stumbled upon them. And they seemed to be from a community that lived around this, the Dead Sea, it's a Dead Sea because it's a very salty sea. And not a lot can live in it. So I don't think any fish can live in it. But anyways, they're a community, and where were they? Let's say they were around this region, the northern part of the Dead Sea. From a community that is called Qumran. And this was a community of Jews who lived during the time of Jesus, the 1st century AD. And they had this community. They had lived there before. They were there before Jesus, so they pre-existed Jesus. And they were a community of Jews that kind of had separated themselves from Jewish society for a variety of reasons. They didn't like what was going on in the temple. They thought the priesthood was corrupt and illegitimate. so they had their own community. And they preserved their sacred writings, their scriptures, and some of the writings of the community. So these were found in the 1940s, and quite by accident, and even quite by accident by archaeologists, because, I mean, the kid who found them, I mean, brought them to his family. They didn't realize that they had found this great historical find. I mean, they were like using it to put to the fireplace because they wanted to keep warm. So they're using the stuff for fuel. And somehow some fragment or some manuscript got into the hands of like an archaeologist or someone who could read the languages. Like, wait a second, this is valuable. You know, number one, stop burning them, and number two, tell me where you found them. And they found more caves and they found more documents. Okay, so Qumran in the 1940s. So amongst this Qumran community, we found copies of their scriptures. In fact, we found, like, you know, the oldest versions of the Old Testament that we have. The book of Isaiah is what we have, a whole scroll of Isaiah, and it's the earliest copy we have of any book of the Old Testament. It goes back maybe to the 300s BC. It is probably datable to the 100s BC, but it's still very old. Nevertheless, in regards to the Deuterocanonicals, we found fragments of the book of Baruch. So they apparently had the book of Baruch in Greek. We also found Aramaic and Hebrew manuscripts of the book of Tobit amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they apparently accepted Tobit because they were copying it and they were reading it. Also, portions of the book of Sirach in Hebrew were found at Qumran, and we found copies other places as well, and other places in Israel, but also over in Jewish communities in Alexandria, in a synagogue in Alexandria. And other books we know were written in Hebrew, like the first book of Maccabees. We only have it in Greek, but we can tell from the way the Greek is written that its prototype, its underlying text was Hebrew. The same thing might be also the case in the book of Judith, but we only have Greek copies of them. So anyways, these books were still floating around amongst the Jews, even when they supposedly canonized them at this school in Israel. I'll tell you the school. I'll show you where it is. It's here on the coast. And it was in this town of Jamnia. It's also called Jabneh, just so you know, because you'll see it by the name of Jabneh as well. But Jamnia is the traditional name. Anyways, they established a school there after the destruction of the temple. And apparently that's where the rabbis decided, okay, we'll only accept certain books. And there are various stories about why. They only accepted books that were written in Hebrew because that was the language that God spoke. They only accepted 22 books because those were the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So anything beyond 22, they just said, no, we won't accept. They only accepted books that came from the time of, like, the 400s BC. There are different ideas of what theories they were working with, but we don't know exactly for sure. We just know that eventually these books were not accepted amongst the Jews. They were accepted amongst some Jews, and they were certainly accepted amongst the Christian Jews, apparently, because they accepted the Septuagint. Okay. Now, the acceptance of the canon took time amongst the Jews, as I told you, but it took time amongst Christians as well. I mean, Christians they had Bibles, they had the Septuagint. It seems that seemed to have been the Bible preference in the Christian church because it's quoted so often, it's relied upon. But that doesn't mean that everything was 100% crystal clear. It takes time to determine what do we accept and what don't we accept. Because it wasn't just a question about the Old Testament, but once you have Christian writings appearing for what we call the New Testament, we've got a lot of Christian writings that we know about. Not all of them make it into the New Testament. Why? Okay, that's the question. What happens? In regards to the Old Testament, we have the longer list of books are generally favored in the Western Church. And the earliest list that we have favoring this longer list that I just described to you with the Deuterocanonicals comes to us from what's called the Council of Rome. It was a council, it was really a local council bishops, but led by the Bishop of Rome, who at the time was Pope St. Damasus. We have Pope St. Damasus, okay, who I didn't put his date there, but he died in 384, so he died 2 years after this council was apparently held. He died in 384. Let me go write that out there. So he died in 384 AD. But 2 years before he died in 382, he held a council of the Roman Church in which it specified that, yes, we do accept the canon with the longer list of books, the one that we've received, which is with the Deuterocanonicals, and that was accepted and proclaimed. This is also the view of a very famous theologian and church father named St. Augustine of Hippo, who comes from North Africa, right below Italy, if you look on a map. He died in 430. And in his book on Christian doctrine, De Doctrina Christiana, on Christian doctrine, he defends this longer canon. He was a major defender of this tradition of the Septuagint with its longer canon, because there were some that did not necessarily agree. Even in the Western Church, there were some that said, well, the Jews should know which books are acceptable, and since they only accepted 22 and they did not accept these extra books, they did not accept these books, the Deuterocanonicals, or they did not accept Esther with additions or Daniel with additions, the longer versions, neither should we, because the Jews should know. It's their books, right? Forgetting the fact that the early Christians were Jews too, and they apparently didn't know the history of the Septuagint, that it was actually being used. But anyways, but that was the argument, and it seemed to make sense. So you had people, even the saints, you had a man named St. Jerome, you had a man named St. Hilary of Poitiers in France, ancient Gaul, modern day France, who were of that position that we should use the canon, we should just use the canon that the Jews said, but the Pope and St. Augustine disagreed. They said, no, this is sacred tradition. This has been handed on to us from the apostles. And this idea, or the idea of the longer canon, was further confirmed by another pope, Pope St. Innocent I. And Pope Innocent, who died in 417, wrote a letter to a bishop in Gaul, ancient France, Gaul. And he wrote to this man, Exuperius. And in this letter, which is known as Consulenti Tibi, from its opening words, Consulenti Tibi, Pope Innocent confirms the decision, the decision of the Council of Rome. He agrees that the longer canon is authoritative. And so this witness comes to us from the 5th century. You can see when he reigned, he reigned from 401 to 417, so from the early 5th century. And he's just confirming what had already been stated before in 382 by the Council of Rome under Damasus. For his part, going back to Augustine of Hippo, because Augustine was a bishop, he was not just a great thinker and a theologian, he, for his part, held 2 councils, one in Hippo, the city where he was living, but also in Carthage, which is a major city in North Africa. And in those councils, he also, actually 2 councils in Carthage, so we have a total of 3, 1 in Hippo and 2 in Carthage, where he kind of moved for the acceptance of this longer version of the canon, especially against those who might be questioning it. That's usually how the church works. The church usually doesn't preemptively define something for people to believe. Usually there's a problem, there's a question, and then the church has to respond to it. And that's what was going on here. You had some people in the Western church who were questioning, what should we accept as our scriptures? Are these really scriptures? We've been using them, but should we? Are they legitimate? And so the church has to respond to this. So you have the popes of Rome and other major thinkers like Augustine who respond to this and say no, or yes, we should be using this, and no, we disagree with those who say there should be a shorter canon. For example, That's the Western Church. The Eastern Church, which is probably more, since it's closer to Palestine, is more influenced by the shorter canon view. Many Christian leaders in the Eastern Church favored more or less, not exactly, the shorter canon that was eventually decided by the Jewish community. And the argument went thus. Actually, I have the argument thus, and then my argument goes nowhere in my notes, so... Anyways, forget about what I just said about that. The argument was put forward by people like St. Melito of Sardis, who dates from the 190s, which is pretty early. It's pretty early evidence, actually. Another person we have is this great church father, very influential church father from the early church, Athanasius of Alexandria, Egypt. Okay? And you can see when they lived. You can see 190 for Melito and Athanasius. Did I write down Athanasius? Well, it's 4th century, obviously. But I forget if did I write down in my notes when he died? No, I didn't. Oh, well. That's all right. I think I have. For Melito, we have this fragment which is reproduced in an early Christian history. This early Christian history was written by a man named Eusebius, the ecclesiastical history or the church history. So if you want to look it up for yourself online, you can. It's in book 4, number 20 or chapter 26 if you're curious. But we have a fragment. We don't actually have the writing of Melito, but it's been copied into this history by Eusebius. And I'm not going to go into it in detail because I do want to move along, but I do want to point out some things. He's writing to someone who has asked him, basically, this brother Onesimus, this man Onesimus, who has asked him seemingly what the canon is and what he should do. And Melito says, well, I went east. You look here in the middle here. I went east. I looked east. I went where the Jews are. It's fine. They should know. That's the assumption. They should know what should be in their scriptures. And I looked. I learned accurately the books of the Old Testament, and these are they. So he gives a list. Okay? And for the most part, it's, it's in agreement with the Jewish list of 22 books, but not completely. Because, for example, he doesn't mention the book of Lamentations, which is in the Jewish scriptures. He probably includes it with the book of Jeremiah, we imagine. Because Lamentations was said to have been written by the prophet Jeremiah. And what about Baruch? Does he also include Baruch? Because Baruch was considered the scribe of Jeremiah. He doesn't say, but he doesn't include Lamentations. Okay? He only gives one book of Esdras, which actually is probably the 2 books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So he does include the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, but they were, at that period of time, they were joined together as one book. Okay? Again, here he mentions the 4 books of Kings, but that would include, in modern Bibles, in your Bibles, that includes 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Okay, so there's no problem there. All right, so that's the list he gives, and it's the shorter list. He does not include the Deuterocanonicals. Such are the words of Melito. So that's his evidence. Here's just a quote from St. Augustine showing you, I put this on here just to show you, you can read it yourself. I don't think I'm going to go over it very much, just where Augustine includes the Deuterocanonicals and makes his argument for that. This is from On Christian Doctrine that I mentioned already. And he says this is the whole canon of Scripture, which includes these longer books. So just for comparison with Melito, who gives the shorter list, okay, pretty much what the Jews had. And here's the longer list, which other Jews did also have, okay, from the Septuagint. This is St. Athanasius. St. Athanasius is important not just for the Old Testament, but also for the New Testament, because in his festal letter, and that's what I give you here if you look back on this PowerPoint, St. Athanasius' festal letter, what feast is he talking about? He's talking about the Feast of Easter. Every year they would put out a letter letting people know when the Feast of Easter was going to be celebrated, because it jumps around. It jumps around based on when the moon It's based on a lunar calendar. So when the moon appears during a certain months. So Easter can be early. It can be like it's going to be early this year in March, but it can be late. It can be in April. So it moves around. So the church would oftentimes, for a long time actually, up until modern times, would announce in the church each year the dates for certain feasts, and one of them being Easter. And they still have a ritual for doing this. I don't know that any church actually does this, but the ritual's still out there if they want to sing to the people, because it should be sung actually, when the various feast days are going to be held during the year. But nowadays you don't really need to because you got a calendar. You look on your cell phone. You don't need to. So they probably don't do it anymore. But in the Middle Ages, you needed to. So this is the festal letter in which that they would issue every year to Christians in Alexandria, Egypt, and this part of the world, telling them, this is when Easter will be celebrated. And oh, by the way, let's talk about some other things. And in the context of the festal letter that he issues, Athanasius, this great church father, talks about the canon of Scripture. Both canons of Scripture. He gives us both the Old Testament, what he accepts as the Old Testament, but he also gives us our first list of the New Testament. So he's the first one who gives us the official list the church accepted of the New Testament writing. So it's important for that. It's very significant for that. In his list of Old Testament books, notice he says they're 22 in number. For as I have heard, it is handed down that this is the number of the letters amongst the Hebrews, i.e. the Jews. So that's his reasoning, his rationale. He says because there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, there should be 22 books. Problem is that the Christians accepted more books. So how do we fit them in? Okay. Well, there are devices for that. Ezra works, as I showed you before, because it's Ezra and Nehemiah. They're counted as one book. So they'd be one letter. So you can fit these two books into one to fit it into the Hebrew alphabet. The 12 prophets, there are 12, what they're called minor prophets, because their books are relatively short, so they're called minor. Not that they're minor, but as in less, which is short. Collapse them into one book. So now instead of having 12 books, you have one book. Again, another Hebrew letter. So you can fit it into this device of the Hebrew alphabet. And if you're seeing how this works. Then he mentions Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah. He mentions Jeremiah with Baruch, interestingly enough. So he does include Baruch, the scribe of Jeremiah. He does include, actually there are two books in the book of Baruch. There's Baruch proper, but then chapter 6 is the letter of Jeremiah that I told you about, which really is a separate book, but it got glommed on to Prophet Baruch, or Baruch the scribe. So that's interesting. That's a little wrinkle that Athanasius does include that. Lamentations he mentions, and the epistle. So he does actually specifically mention the letter of Jeremiah. So it makes that specification, just so you know. It's not just Baruch proper, but also the letter of Jeremiah. So he includes those two. So it's not exactly as the Jewish canon. He does have a little bit of a longer canon than the Jews do, all right, even though he's usually given as an example of the shorter one. And then we have here the books of the New Testament, which is exactly as we have it today. There's nothing to say about that. There's no change in that. Okay? These are the fountains of salvation, and these alone is proclaimed the doctrine of godliness. So it gives you a little theological understanding of what the books of Scripture are for, which is basically what we read from 2 Timothy, but also we read from Dei Verbum, that the Bible is there to teach the truths of salvation, and in 2 Timothy, to equip a man or a woman to perform works of righteousness, works of godliness. Okay? Now, he gives a little note at the end. He says, there are other books besides these not indeed included in the canon, but appointed by the fathers to be read by those who newly join us. So we give them to newbies, people who are coming into Christianity, okay? Because they're still useful for teaching. They still have some worthwhile doctrines. And so these people who newly join us and wish for instruction in the word of godliness. So he doesn't seem to think they're inspired or as inspired but they are helpful for teaching people righteousness. And so he mentions some of the Deuterocanonicals, the Book of Wisdom. He mentions Sirach. He mentions Esther. I'm presuming the longer version of Esther here, not Hebrew Esther. But then again, we'd have to look up to his canon for the Old Testament. Is Esther up there? And I don't think she is. He doesn't include Esther. So not even Hebrew Esther, interestingly enough. The book of Judith and the book of Tobit, and that which is called the teaching of the apostles and the shepherd of Hermas. Okay, we know about the teaching of the apostles. It actually was we didn't actually find copies of it until the 1800s. We only knew it by name. And someone, again, stumbled upon this book called The Teaching of the Apostles. We do know about the Shepherd of Hermas. That's been around. So we have an idea about that. So you can see for him, the Old Testament canon is kind of unsettled. And there are even some books that could have been included in the New Testament, like the Shepherd of Hermas. And in fact, in some early manuscripts, you do find, like the Shepherd of Hermas, attached to the New Testament at the end, that he does not accept and were not accepted by the church later. So that's interesting. Baruch is included, but Esther is not. Okay. For the church, the list of books, again, the church works by just living the faith. And then questions come up, and the questions have to be answered, especially if they're serious ones. That's generally how it works. The church, you're not going to find that the church is constantly giving answers. So why doesn't the church tell us whether evolution is true, biological evolution? Why doesn't the church have a teaching on X? Why doesn't the church have a teaching on Y? Well, it will if it becomes an issue for Christian belief, if it becomes a serious enough issue. But if it's a new issue that's just arisen, probably not. The church is working on the general principles that she has from the Bible, from sacred tradition, from previous teachings of the church. Those usually seem to work quite well until they don't. And then you might have to call a church council. So, it shouldn't be surprising that it took 300 some years for the church to kind of address which books Christians should be reading in their Bibles. And even then, not fully officially. You have a local council of Rome. You have some church fathers talking about it. A couple of popes, That's pretty high authority. But the list of books that you find in the Christian Bible were not officially decided in the Western Church until 1442. So well into the Middle Ages. At a council called the Council of Florence in Italy. Okay, so it's a church council, so called by the Pope at the time. I want to say Pope Eugene the something. I forget. Anyone want to look that up for me? That'd be great. I think it's Pope Eugene, but I don't know which one. I'll give me an extra credit point. So Florence in 1442, there was a big church council. Actually, there were a series of church councils. They met all over Italy, actually. They moved around, and that's a whole story that I'm not going to get into. But they were kind of a reunion council. They wanted to unite Christians of the East with the Church of the West because there had been a separation. And so the popes were big on that. They wanted a reunion. They wanted unity in the Christian church again. They wanted to end the separation. And part of that was, we need to establish our essential working document. What are we working from here? We say we accept the Bible. What do we mean by that? So the church was specific at this council. So in 1442, the Catholic Church, at least the church in the West, officially established at the Council of Florence what books should be in the Bible, which would be what you have today and was before. It's not like they invented it. This was the list that had preceded that well into early church history, including the Deuterocanonicals, the books of the New Testament, Now, in Eastern Christianity, like the Eastern Orthodox, because the Eastern churches, like the Russian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, Bulgarian Orthodox, who are not in communion with Rome, they've never officially established. They work off of sacred tradition. They've never officially established at all what is the official list. They go by the traditional list, and so sometimes, and you can find this online. You can also buy Eastern Orthodox Bibles. They'll sometimes include extra books that the Catholic Church does not accept. Like they have an additional psalm to the Book of Psalms, Psalm 151. They might accept the third and fourth books of Maccabees. There are extra books of Maccabees, or say they're books of Maccabees. So they might accept the third and fourth books of Maccabees. Am I missing anything? The New Testament's the same. That's not an issue. It's mainly the Old. It's pretty much the Old Testament. I feel like I'm missing one other book, but I could be wrong. No, anyways. And for Eastern Orthodox Christians, they're working from the Septuagint. That is still their standard text. So they're still very traditional about that. Their translations into whatever language, be it English or Greek or Russian or whatever, will be based not on the original Hebrew texts, but they will always be based on the Septuagint Bible, because that is the traditional Christian Bible. Roman Catholic Bibles, like the one we have for this class, the New American Bible, will look to the Septuagint when all we have is the Greek text, like in the case of the Book of Judith or the Book of Wisdom, but normally they will try to go to the original text. So the texts that we found for the Book of Tobit that are in Aramaic or Hebrew, they'll base their original readings on that, and they'll fill in later with the Septuagint. But mainly they follow what's going on in modern historical scholarship of the Bible. They would try to go to the original Hebrew texts and base it on that, and not on the Septuagint, which can sometimes have different readings. So, I mean, that's a question. Oh, wait a second. Make sure I didn't... yeah, that's fine. Okay. So now let's move on to the New Testament canon. And I'm just looking at my notes because I think these are repeats. I think I already mentioned this stuff. Okay. So we have Jesus and his movement, and they had scriptures. They had probably the Septuagint, because that's what 2/3 of the time they quote from in the New Testament when they quote from the Old Testament, when the Christian writers quote from the Old Testament. But then again, then we start having very early on, specifically Christian writings appearing and being added to the Jewish writings. And you see this development in even how your Bible is formed. A Christian Bible is formed. The whole first part of your Bible are the Jewish writings, the Hebrew writings, the Old Testament. And notice that the New Testament does not come first. We didn't put them on the beginning. They're added onto the Old Testament. Okay, we have Christian writings that come later and are added onto the scriptures that Christians already had in the early church. So you see that development in the very making of your Bible. You could, for all intents and purposes, put the New Testament first, but the church didn't. It recognizes that the Christian revelation is a fulfillment. It's an add-on to the Jewish revelation. And so the New Testament is encapsulating and handing on the special divinely revealed way that the churches remember Jesus. So it's the memory of Jesus. So what is the New Testament? Well, the New Testament is divided into 4 sections. We have Gospels. We have a book called the Acts of the Apostles, one book. We have a bunch of letters. And finally, we have one book called the Apocalypse of John. Okay? I'll go over each of these things. What are they? Let's start with the Gospels. The Gospel is a genre of literature, of Christian literature, I should say, because it only appears with Christianity. It didn't exist before. But it's a genre of Christian literature which contains the details of Jesus' ministry and teaching. And the Gospels come first because they comprise the main focus of the New Testament. What does the word mean? The word comes from a Greek word, evangelion, which are two words actually. The prefix eu, which means good, and we have this in English. We use this in Greek-based words. So euphony, which means good sounds and stuff like that. Euphoria, good feelings. Okay, so we know this word already. So good, and angelion, from which we get our word angel, which angel simply means a messenger. Because an angelos, an angelion or an angelos is stop saying angelos, that's an angel. Angelion means a message, or it means news that's proclaimed. So the good message, or the good news. For Christianity, there is really only one good news. The subject of that good news is Jesus, of course. But that good news is given to us according to four distinct traditions, which are kind of interrelated and kind of independent. We'll talk about that in a moment. These four traditions are according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The four holy Gospels. And there I have them on the PowerPoint in order in which they are given in the New Testament, but that's not their historical order. Mark is in red because scholars believe that Mark, the Gospel according to Mark, was actually written the first or the earliest around the 60s AD, could be as late as 70. The next earliest would be the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, which are written probably sometime in the 80s, between 80 and 85 AD. And the latest would be the Gospel of John, which scholars believe was written sometime between 90 and 100 AD. So the Gospels were written over a period of time from around the 60s AD to 100 AD, according to the order of Mark, then Matthew and Luke, then John. I have this picture on here. This is a picture of Papyrus 52. Papyrus is just a word for ancient paper. Okay, you would take like reed plants and then you would lay them out and someone would beat them together, and the pulp would all kind of like dissolve and mix together, and then it would dry into this thin sheet of ancient paper, which you could then write on. Very nice, but it doesn't last very well over the ages. Nevertheless, so if you find a papyrus, ancient paper, with a written document, it's usually very old, so it's very valuable. And so we have papyri, plural, of the New Testament. And this is a fragment of the Gospel of John, even though, interestingly enough, it's a fragment of part of the Gospel of John, which is our earliest fragment for any writing of the New Testament. It dates to 125 AD, Papyrus 52, 125. This is kind of ironic, that our earliest fragment that we have of anything from the New Testament is actually from the latest of the Gospels, not the earliest. But anyways, so the Gospel of John, this is Papyrus 52, so I put that on here. It's our earliest evidence for the New Testament writings. And I give you this little short quote from Dei Verbum number 18, where it just says that the Gospels are the heart of all the Scriptures for Christians, of all the Scriptures, Old and New Testament. The Gospels are the heart. Why? Because they are our principal source for the life and teaching of the incarnate Word, the Word made flesh, Jesus the Lord, our Savior, which would stand to reason. I mean, you see this in any religion. Anything that relates to the founder is going to be more important than other writings that come after it or are related to it. And it's the same thing in Christianity. The Gospels talk about Jesus. They tell us about Jesus, what he did, what he said, so they comprise the heart of what Christians look to for their ideas about Jesus. I guess I'll go into this. some of this. I'm not going to go into all of this. What is the relationship between the God? Actually, I'm going to skip over this. I won't test you on this. I want to save some time. And this is kind of inside baseball, Mr. Zayas Bazan. And we can move on with this. But if you look at this picture I have here, it just shows the relationship between the Gospels, which I'll summarize very, very quickly. But I'm not going to get into the synoptic and the Q source. Don't worry about it. Well, I might mention the Q source, but I'm not going to get into the synoptic. But scholars believe the relationship between the Gospels, there's some distinction, but there's also some independence. John is independent. John, is writing on his own. He writes his own story and has his own kind of picture of Jesus. John is kind of like an artist in a way. Mark tells a more bare-bones story, as you might know if you've read the Gospel of Mark. He doesn't tell it necessarily in order. Okay, he kind of skips around. But he just gives, Jesus went here and Jesus did this, and sometimes Jesus said this, but, he's more historical if you want to put it in that way. Whereas John does have history and historical details, but he's more trying to give you a vision of who Jesus is. Mark's gospel, as I said, was the earliest and was probably copied by Matthew and Luke. Okay, they seem to rely on Mark's gospel because all of Mark's gospel is contained in Matthew's gospel and Luke's gospel. All of it. I should say not all of it. Almost all of it. Okay? And they follow sometimes they follow Mark's wording very exactly, but they also follow the order of stories, the order that Mark puts the stories in. So there's good evidence that Matthew and Luke are independently relying on Mark's gospel. Matthew and Luke don't know each other because their differences are too great, so they don't seem to be looking over each other's shoulder like, okay, what's Matthew writing? Okay, there's just no evidence of that. But there is evidence they copied Mark. They also have their own special stories. I mean, Matthew's gospel is significantly longer than Mark, so he has a whole bunch of material that he knows about Jesus, especially sayings material. So does Luke. He includes the sayings material. And they agree. I mean, they weren't using each other's gospels, but they seem to have very similar sayings of Jesus that Mark doesn't have. And scholars call this source of sayings that both Matthew and Luke include, Q. Why do they call it Q? Nobody knows. Sometimes you'll hear, the argument or the statement. Oftentimes you'll hear this, but we don't know ultimately. It comes from the German word Quelle, which means source. So a sayings source, a Redensquelle. You see this in books all the time. But ultimately, we really don't know who was the first one to come up with this designation, and we're not sure what Q means. It's probably, I'm assuming, it seems logical that it's an abbreviation for the German word source from German New Testament scholars, but no one's been able to really track it down. Nevertheless, it's become traditional amongst New Testament scholars, so it's not going to change anytime soon. So the Q source, a bunch of sayings by Jesus, a list of sayings that are included in Matthew's gospel and Luke's gospel that they share, but are apparently not copying from each other. And then you have to include all the stories that Luke tells that nobody else has, like the stories of Jesus' birth and stuff like that. Mark doesn't have them, and they don't agree with Matthew, so they're independent of Matthew or Mark. And then Matthew also has his own stories, which are called M. Luke's stories are L. Matthew's are called M for his special material that he adds on that he knows about the story of Jesus. Okay, so these are how the Gospels, it's a rough sketch of how the Gospels have been created and come down to us in their relationships. So if you're reading the Gospels and you say to yourself, well, man, sounds like I've read this before. Yeah, you're onto something. You're starting to think like a New Testament scholar. Where did it come from? And this sounds like what Mark wrote in his gospel. Probably because Matthew or Luke was copying it, or had a similar oral tradition that Mark had as well. That's a possibility. Although most scholars think they actually had a written copy of Mark's gospel, but there's no way to prove that. Anywho, so that's the relationship between the gospels. Because, and I'm not going to worry about the synoptic problem. I did mention Q, so I give you a definition there. the common source of material about Jesus used by Matthew and Luke. Okay. And the Gospel of John I mentioned. The next book and the next section after the Gospels is Acts of the Apostles. And really, Acts of the Apostles is part of the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke, this man Luke actually wrote a two-part work. He begins with the Gospel, and then he adds a little historical book onto it about the early church, which has come to be called Acts of the Apostles. So actually, they are combined together. They're called Luke Acts by scholars. And they comprised a single two-part unit, but they've been separated into two books. The Gospel per se has been separated and put with the Gospels, and the history has been put out on its own as Acts of the Apostles. In Acts of the Apostles, Luke tells the story of the early church. The first few decades, okay? According to his own theological interests, he wants to show how the gospel was spreading out into the larger world. He wants to describe the early conflict with Jews that did not accept Jesus as the Messiah. He wants to talk about the entry of non-Jews, Gentiles, into the church. And then finally, he wants to talk about how this man Paul ended up in Rome, the center of the Roman Empire, which is where the Acts of the Apostles ends, with Paul preaching the gospel in Rome. Doesn't say anything more about Paul's history. So that's what's going on there. It's a little history book, and it contains a lot of historical information. Some of it's pretty accurate, a bunch of speeches, okay, which are probably not... are added by Luke, but reflect early Christian preaching about Jesus, so they're very valuable for that because they predate Acts of the Apostles and probably predate even Luke's Gospel. I'll mention that with Paul's letters, I think. And scholars date it, Luke wrote probably around the 80s, wrote his Gospel probably around the 80s, so obviously if the Gospel comes first in the two books, and Acts of the Apostles comes later, it's probably written later in this time frame, closer to the 90s, So 80 to 90 AD is when scholars will date Luke Acts. Then we have the letters. Now notice the dates on the letters, circa 50 to circa 125. And that tells you something. That tells you that actually, some of the letters in the New Testament were written before the Gospels, if the Gospels date to the 60s. So in some cases, some of the New Testament letters are earlier than the Gospels. What are these letters? Well, we have several of them, a bunch of them. They were written by apostles, people who were part of the 12 apostles, so they say. Okay, that's the traditional attribution to the 12 apostles. Some of the 12 apostles, not all of them, wrote letters. People like Peter, okay, Simon Peter, who is one of the apostles of Jesus. Then later converts, like Paul of Tarsus, this man Paul I've mentioned. And then we have some letters that are by anonymous disciples of Jesus. They're Christians, but we don't know if they're apostles or not. We don't know what their relationship is to the larger Christian community. This man Paul, who, interestingly enough, who was not an original apostle of Jesus, he was not one of the 12 apostles at all, he was not even a follower of Jesus during Jesus' ministry. His letters make up the bulk of the letters in the New Testament, and actually make up the bulk of the New Testament. Most of the New Testament is Paul's letters, if you count the books. Oh, I should mention that as well. Well, yeah, I mentioned that already. Why I mentioned Paul? Why is letter to the Hebrews on the PowerPoint as I'm looking? Because that's one of those letters that we don't have a name for it. It's not identified with anybody. It doesn't tell us who wrote it at all. And it's not even in the form of a letter. It seems to be a sermon or a homily, something that someone preached to the community. So it's not really even a letter. And it doesn't identify who it is. So, okay, that would be one exception where we don't know we don't know who wrote it. And then other Christians I mentioned. So, for example, I mentioned about Paul, and most of the letters, or most of the writings of the New Testament come from Paul, certainly most of the letters. And it is his letter, in case you're curious, which is the first, or I shouldn't say the first, but the most original or earliest of the New Testament writings. His first letter to the Corinthians is dated by scholars to be around 50. It could be the late 40s, like maybe 48, but around 50 seems a good ballpark figure, which would predate the earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, by around a decade. Okay? So 1 Thessalonians is actually our earliest New Testament writing, earlier than the Gospels. When we talk about Paul's letters, and this is the list, if you combine these two lists, these are the list of those letters that are ascribed to Paul, but we have to distinguish within the list. These letters here in red and emboldened are believed by scholars to have actually come from Paul, whether directly or indirectly. So the letter to the Romans, the community in Rome, 2 letters to the church in Corinth, a Greek city, 2 letters to a region of Turkey called Galatia, the Galatians, Philippians, a city called Philippi, letter to the first letter to the Thessalonians, Thessalonica in Greece, and then a letter to a man named Philemon, the letter to Philemon, who is a man, not a city or a region. These other letters, we're not sure. So a letter to the city of Ephesus in Turkey, Colossae in Turkey, so there's city in Turkey, letter to the Colossians. The second letter to the Thessalonians, the church of Thessalonica. 2 letters to a man named Timothy, and a letter to a man named Titus. Scholars are not 100% sure, and a lot of scholars would say definitely not by Paul. So we have the authentic letters of Paul, but we also have inauthentic. So 7 out of Paul's 13 letters are considered to be authentic, and then these others are probably not by him. Honestly, I don't think the arguments for the inauthentic letters are really that strong. The arguments usually run along the lines of, well, the style of language and writing is different. Some of the words used are different, or, they're not interpreted in the same way in other letters of Paul that we believe are authentic. He uses concepts a little bit differently. So it seems like it's somebody else writing in the name of Paul. Okay, fine. Except the letters identify themselves as being from Paul and his companions whom he names. Of course, that doesn't mean anything. The person could be lying, just saying, I'm Paul, when they're not, Like when you go on YouTube and you see a video and you find out later it's been generated by AI, It's just like, it shows, Taylor Swift saying, she loves you or something. Turns out, no, it's an artificial intelligence. So this would be like a version of that. Someone just says that he's writing, his name is Paul the Apostle, but it's really not, but he's writing this letter in the name of Paul. Okay, well, we know Paul used secretaries to write his letters. And secretaries would write down what the person told him, but they would also embellish. We know from letter writing in that time period, they would embellish, they would correct things, correct grammar, stuff like that. That was seen as part of their job. There was nothing unusual about that. So some of the argument, or one of the arguments goes, well, these letters don't necessarily have to be by Paul. They could be a secretary, so that might explain why there's some verbal differences and maybe the style is a little bit different. Although you can still connect it up with his authentic letters. Evidence supporting this is the fact that this letter, the first letter here, the letter to the Romans, which almost no New Testament scholar denies was written by Paul. I mean, they would almost all say, definitely, 100% Paul wrote this. Problem is, at the end of the letter, the writer of the letter identifies himself, the scribe, the secretary. It says, I, Tertius, the writer of this letter. I'll write his name in the board soon. I, Tertius, the writer of this letter, send you greetings. He greets the members of the Church of Rome. And he names himself, and he's not Paul. But at the beginning of the letter, it says Paul, and so I think Timothy and his companions. So I mean, it's not we have a letter that is supposedly authentically Paul, that we know was written by somebody else in the name of Paul, his secretary, that Paul probably dictated to him. So why couldn't he have done that in these other letters? Okay, that seems to be an argument against this. So, anyway, take it for what it's worth. I'm giving you the scholarly view of what scholars will accept and what they won't. I personally, this is not a hill for me to die on. I don't have a problem accepting these other letters as written by Paul, either directly or indirectly. In fact, I don't think most of the letters Paul supposedly wrote were written by him directly. I think he dictated them and someone wrote them down for him. But anyways, so just so you know, there is some question about that. What are the letters? Just a brief summary of what the letters contain. All sorts of things. I mean, there's no way to summarize them by just one blanket statement. I mean, all sorts of questions. Again, Paul is writing to Christian people, but also Christian communities, and he's usually writing to them when there are problems in the community. People have questions. For example, some people in the Corinthian community were saying that the end of the world had already come, the resurrection of and there was no resurrection of the dead and stuff like that. So he had to address that. And again, in the Corinthian community, there are a lot of problems in the Corinthian community. One dude is committing incest. I think he's sleeping with his mother, or his mother. Anyway, his aunt. Oh, I think it's his aunt. And Paul is just like, kick him out of the community. Get rid of this dude, So he has to address that, Galatians, in the letter to the Galatians, the Christians there are being stirred up by other Christians who are saying, you really have to follow the Jewish laws. Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was circumcised. Jesus ate kosher, apparently. Jesus went to the temple. So why aren't we Christians doing these things, And so they were kind of like stirring up the non-Jewish Christians into thinking, yeah. So Paul has to write a letter to the Galatians, the Christians living in the region of Galatia in Turkey, to kind of like talk them off the ledge and say, no, you don't need to continue following the Jewish laws anymore. Whether you agree with his argument or not is another question, but that's what's going on in Galatians. So in the letters to Timothy and Titus, the two letters to Timothy and Titus, Paul is talking about church structures. He starts introducing the idea of bishops and deacons and elders, priests, and stuff like that. So he talks about that. By the way, that's another reason why some scholars did not like those letters as being from Paul, because they sounded too Catholic, because they were talking about bishops, priests, and deacons. Because a lot of in the 1800s, you have to understand the milieu and the context. A lot of the biblical scholars at the time, certainly New Testament scholars, were based in Germany, and they were influenced by Lutheranism, by Protestantism. And they even said that this kind of smacked of early Catholicism, and so they didn't like that. So they said, well, Paul couldn't have written that. That's too Catholic. So that was another reason, they're kind of a prejudice against the letters. But anyway, so Paul introduces these ideas in Timothy and in Titus. So that's what's going on in the letters. The last book that we have of the New Testament is this work called the Apocalypse of John, which is one of our later works of the New Testament. It might be one of the last works of the New Testament. It's datable to 90 to 100, and some scholars argue it might be later than 100. What is an apocalypse? Apocalypse comes from two Greek words, apo and krypto, which just simply means to reveal something, to uncover. Okay, so a revelation or an uncovering, an apocalypsis. What did I say? Krypto, right? Apo and krypto, the verb krypto, which means to uncover or to cover up. So it's an uncovering, a revealing. So it's also called the book of Revelation, not the book of Revelations. You'll hear Christians even say that one, and that's wrong. Even though it does have multiple revelations in it, visions, but it's the book of the Revelation, the Apocalypse of John. Who is John, to whom this revelation or this uncovering was made plain? Don't know. Doesn't tell us. Just gives his name John, some Christian named John. Traditionally, people have understood this John to be the Apostle John, one of the 12 apostles. But John was a common name amongst Jews. He doesn't say he's an apostle, which doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it's, who knows, okay? You can't just pinpoint the apostle John because, he must be the most famous John. He must be an apostle. No, he's just some Christian named John who had visions. And he wrote down these visions. And that's what apocalyptic literature is all about. Have your definition. It's a type of literature that interprets history through symbolic visions of the future or of the spirit world. Okay? And you find this literature all throughout religion. You have Jewish apocalyptic, you have Muslim apocalyptic, you have writings about the end of the world for Hinduism. So Christianity is not unusual in having an apocalyptic literature. And because it's visions, using symbolic language, it gets a little bit funky. It can be weird, and you're not sure what it's talking about. And it's not supposed to be taken literally. Okay, these are all symbols of usually what's going on currently in the Christian community. Okay, so for example, famous example that I'll end with from the book of Revelation or the Apocalypse of John. Who is the beast? Well, if you listen to bands like Iron Maiden, then 666 is the number of the beast, which is the devil, because there's a picture of the devil on their album cover. Problem with that is that the devil is not a man. And if you actually read the book, The Apocalypse of John, it says that this is the number of a man, a human being. And the devil is not a man. He's an angel. He's a being of spirit and intellect and will, but not a human being. So right there, we know it's not the devil. Okay? But what does this mean? Because Christians and people have tried to interpret 666 and find the name, what's the name that it's referring to, okay? And we pretty much know who he's referring to, 666. He's referring to a contemporary, a man named Nero, who was the Caesar, the ruler of the Roman Empire at that time. How do we know this? Well, this dude, Nero. That's a bust of Nero. We know this because of because how you spell the name of Nero in Hebrew. Okay? And just like with the Roman numerals with the Septuagint, LXX adds up to 50, Hebrew letters had numerical values. So how you spelled his name, the consonants that you spelled the name of Nero Caesar in Hebrew, if you add them up, they come out to 666, 666. Or they come out to 616. Because you can drop one letter, actually. There's a different spelling of Nero. And if you drop that letter, you end up with 616, which we just happen to have in the manuscript tradition of the Apocalypse of John. This is one of the earliest papyri, might be the earliest we have, of the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of John. It just so happens to have portions of the verse where it mentions the number of the beast, the man who will come, who will be named 666. Right here, you have it in Greek numerals, but it's not 666. If you add the Greek numerals up, the chi, the iota, and the sigma, you add up to 616. So scholars are almost certain that the reference is to Nero Caesar, who, yes, at the time was killing Christians. And apparently it was under Nero that both the apostle Simon Peter and the other apostle, Paul, were executed. It's two of the major apostles of the Christian church. So we have a pretty good handle on what this symbol means, just to give you an idea of what's going on in the book of Revelation. So it's nothing to be scared of and nothing to worry about, but it is kind of interesting. Okay, that's all for now. I will see you on Thursday. God bless you all. Have a good day. Have a good day, miss. Thank you. Oh, Miss Cibarelli, you're here. Oh, good. Let's see. Mr. Grimaldi. No. Mr. Kushner. Have a good day, sir. Thank you. Yes, sorry. There you go. You're welcome. Have a good day. Hey, sir, how's it going? Nobody got me. I'm almost certain it's Pope Eugene, but okay, turn this off.